Hello there, welcome back to Inde-Car. It's the 19th of April today. Normally Inde-Car exists to provide a kind of news service, one which is not normally available to people in Scotland because we have to put up with British television programming and British newspapers and so on. So you know the reason why the show exists. But today I thought I would depart from my usual habits, if you like, of reporting on Scottish news to talk about something completely different, something you may not even be aware of. In fact, most people in Scotland are not aware of it. You may remember the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, which, to be honest with you, I always thought was great fun, and I enjoyed it enormously, but it wasn't very historically accurate. However, in the movie, although Mel Gibson was playing the lead role as William Wallace, despite his diminutive size, the actor who played the then Robert the Bruce before he became king was a Scottish actor called Angus McFadyen. And you may be wondering why you haven't seen Angus for quite a while. Well, you will have seen Angus perhaps a couple of years ago when he went on to make a movie which he wrote himself and starred in, and which he funded with money mostly, I believe, from America and Canada. And this was a biopic, a biographical piece about Robert the Bruce after he had been crowned King of the Scots, but also during a period in his life where he had been chased around Scotland by English forces and presumably traitors and turncoats who wanted to turn him in, and who had suffered a defeat in the early stages of his monarchy. Now, at this point, McFadyen plays King Robert the Bruce at a point where he's been wounded and is on the run, and he's a man who believes that he's failed and he's at the lowest point in his life and is taken in by a young woman and who's looking after two young children in a bothy in a small Scottish cottage in the Highlands. And it's basically a look at the man himself as a human being and as a man who thought that he'd failed and believed that he was never going to unite the clans, was never going to free his land. And so it was a story of personal triumph over adversity. A very good movie, and when I watched the film, I was provoked actually to write a review of it because I felt it had been largely misunderstood by a lot of the audience. Anyway, Angus McFadyen, the star of the movie, actually got back in touch with me. He liked the review and asked me if I would like to look at his next script, which I will come back to in a moment. Now, it's this next script that I wanted to talk to you about. Now, what many of you may or may not know about Angus McFadyen is he's a very strong supporter of independence. And he's never made any secret of the fact that he is a supporter of independence, but because of his political views, the British television and media industry has largely blackballed him from ever appearing here in any kind of TV or movie productions made in the British Isles, and it's largely excluded him and prevented him from funding his own productions. So this being closed out and shut out has forced Angus to work in a different way. Now, the interesting thing about Angus McFadyen is, and another thing that most of you will not know about, where he actually lives now. And he actually lives in Panama, in the very same settlement where Scotland back in 1689 was planning to plant its first colony at a site called Darien, or the Darien Gap, which is at the Isthmus of Panama, the narrowest point between North and South America, which, as you know now, has the Panama Canal linking the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But back in those days, it was the only place where ships could put in and could have their cargoes transported the 20-something miles across the isthmus to the Pacific Ocean and prevent them from having to sail all the way around the bottom of South America to get to the Pacific Ocean, a feat which is extremely dangerous. So there was a strong belief that there should be a settlement there. And most people in Scotland know a little bit about the Darien project, the ill-fated, supposedly, Darien project. If you were to go to Wikipedia and look up Darien as a subject, a historical subject, it says that it was Scotland's attempt to have its own colony in the Americas, and it failed because Scotland didn't do it very well, basically. It didn't say why. It gave a reason as being that the Scottish colony failed to trade with other English colonies further up the coastline in places like Virginia, for example, and never went into any detail about why this particular colony failed and what happened to the people who went there. So Angus McFadyen has written a movie about the real story of Darien, the untold historical story of Darien, what really happened, and looks at the mystery of why it failed. It's interesting to remember that if you skim past the Wikipedia stuff, which is largely written by British historians, and actually look at the detail of what happened before and after Darien, you will discover that the Darien concept, the idea of having a new colony at Panama, wasn't just a Scottish plan. It was an Anglo-Scottish plan. There were a large number of English investors, primarily, I would imagine these would be nobles and wealthy individuals from England, who invested in the project in its early stages, large amounts of money for the time. It needed approximately £400,000, which doesn't sound like a lot in our money, but it would be several hundreds of millions of pounds nowadays if you take into account inflation, the cost of materials and shipping and people. However, the interesting thing about it was that King William of Orange, who we all know as King Billy, and we'll not go into the sectarian connotations of that, King William realised that this Darien project between the English nobles and the Scottish nobles was going ahead, but he didn't like the idea of English nobles or English elites investing in the Scottish project, and so he basically forced the English nobility to pull out of the project, leaving the Scots short of cash, which meant that the rest of the investment which was necessary to provide for this Darien expedition in the first place was largely going to have to be funded by public subscription. And really that is what happened. The Darien project was funded by people, the people of Scotland, and the whole scheme, interestingly, was largely the concept of a single man, whose name has been forgotten in history. But I don't want to spoil the plot of the movie by telling you anything much about that. However, the upshot of all of this is that the Scots had to self-fund this, had to bootstrap it. And a small flotilla of ships set off for Darien in the early part of 1689, if I remember correctly, from Leith, which is actually quite a strange place to set off from if you want to go across the Atlantic, because you've then got to sail all around the top of the north of Scotland first before you can get to the Atlantic, and then you've got to make the trip across the ocean. Now, 2,000 people set off on this expedition in this handful of small ships. But of the 2,000 who set off, about 800 of them were going to die on the trip, mostly from diseases, malnutrition, the kind of diseases which people died of on a fairly regular basis. And remember, they were jammed in the hold of a small wooden ship for months on end, eating a very bland diet of ship's biscuits and salted beef and things like that. So they lacked vitamins, and they suffered from scurvy and various other diseases, and so many of them died that it was beginning to look as if by the time they got there wouldn't be anyone left alive. However, 1,200 made it. They came ashore and they set up a small settlement. They also defended the settlement. One of the key elements of setting up any colony in those days was to build a fortress of some kind and to man it with some soldiery and some cannons to protect your interests. But unbeknownst to the Scots, the English king had decreed that no English colonies were to trade with them. Now, if you look up Wikipedia, you'll see that they say that the reason the Darien project failed was because the Scottish colony failed to sell any of their goods to other English colonies in the Americas. However, what it doesn't say is why they couldn't sell their goods to these English colonies, and it's because there was a ban on it. A royal decree was issued saying that nobody was to trade with a Scottish colony, and not only that, but there was to be a maritime blockade of Darien itself. That meant any shipping going there would be sunk by English warships. So, if you look at this in the round, this entire project, or the Darien project, even if the English ban had not been in place, and even if they had managed to trade, it would still have been extraordinarily difficult. Much of the Darien Isthmus is covered with thick jungle. It's very hot. It's a tropical environment. The Scots were not used to it. They tried to clear some forest to grow some crops, mostly maize and yams. This failed, and again, many of the colonists, in fact most of the colonists, succumbed to illnesses and diseases and fevers just simply because they were not used to these conditions. So it's a very hard ask even without any military blockade by England. Anyway, the upshot of all of this is that the history of this has largely been lost in the revisionist history written by the British Empire after the event took place. So Angus McFadyen's script, which he very kindly provided to me a couple of years ago to look through, and I wasn't criticising, he asked my opinion on it, and I read it through, and it's an excellent script. It will make a fantastic movie, and it tells the true story, and it also asks and provides a potential answer to one of the central mysteries of why this went so badly wrong. It's also worth pointing out that there was a resupply mission launched from Leith to resupply the colony because they realised that it was struggling. However, it never got there, and nobody knows why. Nobody knows what happened to those resupply ships. They just vanished. And this is another central mystery in this entire tale. Angus has felt strongly for a long time that this historical revisionism needs to be set straight. People of Scotland need to know the real history of this project and why it went wrong and what happened to those people. And so he wanted to make this movie, and recently he said to me several times that he would love the movie to be made here in Scotland using Scottish crews, Scottish equipment, Scottish studios and Scottish locations and actors. And this is a natural thing for a man like Angus to want. But unfortunately, the Scottish film industry is run by what used to be the Scottish Arts Council. I think it's now called Creative Scotland or something. There have been various iterations of this agency. Now, Creative Scotland is, I suppose you would call it a quango. It's a quasi-non-governmental organisation set up supposedly by the Scottish Government to fund and to assist in the manufacture of Scottish movie and television productions. However, you will remember recently that it was in the news for all the wrong reasons when it became to light that the Scottish Arts Council, however it now styles itself, had given £84,000 of funding to a production company to make what has turned out to be a porn movie, and not just a soft porn movie either, something really hardcore. And this has raised huge public objections. Most people now realise that this agency consists of a bunch of lubbies giving money to their friends for their really weird projects, and it is nothing at all really to do with funding the best script and the best ideas. And so I said to Angus a few days ago that I would put this programme together and present this to you, my audience, to try to start a campaign to have the Darien movie made here in Scotland and funded by a government agency or by the Scottish Government to make sure that this story is told, and not just told from the British side, but actually the facts of it are told and made known to everyone. So the script, in my opinion at least, is highly accurate, given the facts that we do know, including most of the major central characters, the real people involved, the nobility, the organisers, the sea captains, the crews, and volunteers who were recruited at the dockside in Leith with promises of swaying palm trees and warm climates and a fantastic life on the other side of the ocean. So, what I'm saying to you today is that I would like to launch a campaign, and I would like every one of my viewers to get behind this and to put pressure on the Scottish Government to fund Angus's movie. Angus is probably one of the strongest and most vocal proponents of Scottish sovereignty that I know, and I would love it if he could come back to Scotland to make this film. Any of you who have seen his most recent work, Robert the Bruce, will know the quality of Angus's writing and acting is superb, and yet his previous movie, Robert the Bruce, was made with foreign money because nobody in Scotland would fund that either, despite it being a central part of our history. We need somebody with deep pockets to fund this movie, even if it is not the Scottish Arts Council or Creative Scotland or Scottish Screen or whatever the heck it now calls itself, even if it's not them. Somebody in Scotland must have enough money to make this production and to make a good job of it. There have been many good historical movies made in Scotland, including things like Robert the Bruce, as I've mentioned, but also the story of Rob Roy McGregor with Liam Neeson was very good as well. There have been a number of good movies, but they're very, very thin on the ground, and finding funding for them is so difficult. So my appeal to you really today is, as independent supporters and people who want the rest of Scotland to know its own true history and not a history written by revisionist historians in London, to get behind Angus in this movie. I'm not really sure exactly quite how the campaign will start, but I wanted to put this idea out to you just now for discussion. So if any of you have any ideas about how to coordinate such an effort, let me know, and I will highlight them in my show. In the meantime, I don't have anything much more to add to this story other than I think this is something which is worth doing. It's worth doing for its own sake, for the sake of Scotland itself, to know its own history and to know that the history that's presented to us in things like Wikipedia is not necessarily true. In fact, most of it isn't true, and it leaves out some of the fundamental facts. That Scotland's colony project was sabotaged by an English king and by people working within Scotland to make sure it didn't actually happen. And when it did happen, to make sure that it couldn't be resupplied, and whoever survived this ill-fated attempt at setting up a Scottish colony would be few and far between, and Scotland would never try this again. And remember that it was after the English king decided that English money should be withdrawn from the project that the Treaty of Union began to be drawn up, and pressure started to be put on Scotland to sign it. So by crippling the Scottish colony from the outset, the political manoeuvring of the English state was there to say, oh, you know, your project's failed and you've lost a lot of money. Why don't you just join this union and we'll help you? And in fact, believe it or not, they did that. After the signing of the Union Treaty, a large sum of money was paid into the Scottish Exchequer by the English Exchequer to compensate for the £400,000 loss. Now that was, like I said, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of public money, public subscriptions. That money that was lost was replaced by the English king. And that's almost an acknowledgement that he had something to do with it. So, that's my pitch for you today. Have a think about what I've said. If you're interested in helping me do this, get in touch and we'll mount a campaign. But I think it's high time this movie was made and the true history of Scotland was actually told on the big screen to a big audience. Anyway, that's it from me today. Please keep the faith, and I'll be back again later next week. Bye for now.